And hello, everyone. Welcome to the I Heart America show with Don and Ella. Each week, we take you on a compelling and thrilling journey featuring American legends, unsung heroes, and legendary and esteemed celebrities. You can join us every Monday at 3 p.m. Eastern and noon Pacific Standard Time here on Truth Frequency Radio. Myself and my fellow co-host, best-selling author Donald Jeffries, will showcase incredible stories from fascinating people. Get the inside scoop from the most intriguing people on the planet. And now I'm going to turn it over to my co-host, Donald Jeffries, who will be introducing you today's guest.
Oh, thanks, Ella. Our guest today is Michael Marcades, who is the author of Rose Cherami, Gathering Falling Petals. And those of you who don't know who Rose Cherami was, she was connected to the JFK assassination. And if you ever saw the movie JFK by Oliver Stone, she's played by Sally Kirkland, who we had on this show and talked to. We've talked to her a couple of times. And it's a very powerful, heartfelt book about Michael's dealing with what his mother's life and then her death. So, Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Don. Good to be with you and Ella today.
No, it's great to be with you. So, tell us how you got started down this road. I mean, maybe tell us a little bit about the what you experienced as a child, because it's amazing, and how you eventually came to want to write the book about your mom's life.
Yes,
because,
well,
go ahead.
Actually, the book, I never imagined that what I would be doing would evolve into a book. It actually started out as a journal during my midlife, during my 30s. I just kind of got to a point where I felt like I needed to do anything and everything that I could to get to know my mother better. And ironically, I was given some foundational research documents when my mother died. When my grandparents died, a couple of grocery sacks full of pictures, documents, handwritten letters, and the like. And at the time when I received those two grocery sacks, I had no idea how important those sacks would become in my life. But I think I was thinking about this a little earlier today as I was taking my 3-mile walk. That
Michael, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but to set it up so people listening know who we're referring to, can you just give a couple sentences on exactly who your mother is and how people might be familiar with her?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you sound great, Michael.
Okay, yes. Well, my mother is Melba Christine Youngblood Marcades. That was her non-alias names. And that is where I get my last name, of course. But most people will know her in the JFK assassination community as Rose Cherami. Rose Cherami is one of probably a dozen or more aliases that Mother utilized during her unique life as a drug runner, prostitute, heroin addict, etc. And then, like Don said, she was depicted in Oliver Stone's film JFK. A lot of what was depicted in that film was accurate based on research that was available at the time. But I've discovered a lot of things about her related to the Kennedy assassination and indeed her entire life since then.
And how did you discover the truths about your mother? I mean, did you know growing up that she was participating in some of these nefarious activities? And we can go into her background so people understand why she was the way she was.
Okay. Did I know? No. Did my family know? Honestly, I seriously doubt that they had any inkling of the depth of criminal activity that Mother was involved in. Of course, they knew had a problem with drugs and alcohol, which ironically, I believe was set in motion by an acute case of encephalitis when she was a young child. But my family certainly dealt with her being in and out of hospitals, being on wards designed to deal with people with mental illness. I guess that's what they called it then. But I just think that Mother had some issues with drugs and alcohol. And after she ran away from home at the age of 16, there was little choice for her to survive, and actually that's how she got involved with it, with the drugs and the alcohol.
Okay, and then what created this connection to John F. Kennedy?
Well, the connection with the Kennedy assassination came through Mother's association with the mob, Jack Ruby, Lee Harvey Oswald, and a variety of other people who were actively involved in drug and prostitution across the nation from east to west coast. Mother, near the end of her life, indeed was working for Jack Ruby at the Carousel Club and another club that he owned called the Pink Door. She was one of his major drug carriers, and of course we know Ruby was connected to the mob and disseminated these kind of activities down the chain, so to speak.
And how did the mob, what was the connections to JFK and the mob?
Well, you know, Don and some other people can probably be more definitive about that. It's just in my research, I'm fairly certain that the mob was involved in the Kennedy assassination. I think it would be hard to prove that they were not involved.
Yeah, I think, yeah, if I can interrupt for a second, Ella, the importance of Rose Cherami is that she was admitted to a hospital after an accident shortly before the assassination. And in the hospital, she started talking about they're going to kill JFK. So she was talking about this before the assassination, which is obviously very important. And she was in the circle where, being a stripper and so forth in that world, she knew Jack Ruby, she knew Oswald. She very famously said, you know, when somebody said, does Ruby know Oswald? She said, they're bedmates, you know, they slept together. And they've been shacking up together for years or something. So that she was in that milieu. And of course, you know, if she was just making this up, she was, you know, it was right before he was assassinated. So that's what, and of course, later, a few years later, as Michael will talk about, she ended up dying, and they found out new evidence on her death that she actually was murdered. But so I don't know if is that clear up what you're asking, you think?
Yeah, and then I honestly believe that the CIA at one point was working with the mob in some capacity. At least that's what my research shows. So it may go back to the CIA.
Sure, yeah.
I wouldn't doubt that, of course. I think the left hand definitely knew what that right hand was doing.
Mm-hmm. And let's tell everybody about you. So you, coming from this traumatic upbringing and these tragedies that your mother experienced and endured, you know, you could have gone one way, but you went the other. And I know you are an ordained minister. And what is some of the work that you've done, and how did you overcome these traumatic experiences that you had yourself?
Well, that's really interesting. Actually, the experiences that I had as a child without mother being around was actually, I would say, small compared to the feelings of loss that I experienced as a full-grown adult when I began to piece things together more and more, and honestly come to grips with what I refer to as the huge hole in my heart that was left there because of mother's absence. You know, and also I was very fortunate. At some point in mother's life, she realized when I was almost 5 years old that she simply could not provide the kind of care that I demanded and needed as a young boy, and she, through a very odd sequence of events, wound up turning me over to her parents, my maternal grandparents, and they raised me from 5 years old forward. And although I did see mother a couple of times since that point of separation, it really didn't hit me. Her absence really didn't hit me deeply until I became a full-grown adult.
Mm-hmm.
But I also had plenty of other adults who came into my life. My band director in high school, who really set me on a journey to becoming a professional musician. My music minister at my church in Duncanville, Texas, who probably, impacted my deciding to do full-time ministry for a while. And then I had a man at Texas Tech, Kenneth Davis, who became my mentor during my journey to obtain a PhD and become a college professor. So I have accomplished a lot of things, and I probably pursued many of those accomplishments in an effort to fill some void inside my essence. I still deeply miss my mom and would give anything to see her.
And maybe we can go in chronological order. We understand that when she was younger, she had this case of, I can't even pronounce it, encephalitis.
Encephalitis, yes.
And that is because of the measles or something she might have contracted?
Well, possibly. I just think of it primarily as a virus that impacts the brain, and she was hospitalized for 30 days, had a high fever as a young child for 30 days, which then was pretty devastating on a little girl. And when she finally came around and broke the fever and was released from the hospital, my grandparents had a very interesting conversation with the physicians. At the time, they literally warned them to keep her away from drugs and alcohol, and for them to be really prepared for a very unusual adolescence transition. So this infection of the brain is a bacterial infection, puts a lot of pressure on the brain, and evidently can cause and create some real issues with development, which it certainly did in my mother.
Especially when it affects the brain. I mean, I understand that some of the side effects of what she contracted, like emotional regulation, decision making, and I know she was incarcerated multiple times, and I mean, it's just shocking. And then don't you think maybe how she was raised played into it? Because on a talk you gave, you had talked about when you went to live with your grandparents that possibly her father was abusive or had been.
Yes, and it was the 30s and the 40s. Raising children was infinitely different than raising children now. I mean, I look at it as a time when parents actually looked at their children as property. And I think that my grandfather probably functioned like thousands of other fathers at the time. I think the abuse that he foisted upon his children came in terms of extremely strict discipline, and mother and her two siblings all responded to that differently. I think that mother responded to it in a very rebellious way that just caused her to constantly looking for ways to get away from that. And that's why she initially ran away from home at the age of 14, and came back after that attempt to get away from home. But then at 16, when she ran away, it took for good. So I think that the abuse that was at home, yes, probably could have been some physical abuse. Honestly, as a young boy, I remember getting only one spanking during my entire childhood at the hands of my grandfather. And to this day, I remember the event, So my guess is my mother and my aunts were on the other end of that pretty frequently during their childhood.
Mm-hmm. But you're right. Back then it was different. There was a lot of physical discipline. I know that people used belts, especially in Texas. I know that parents were extra harsh with their kids at that point in time.
Yes, I mean, my grandfather didn't hold back when it was time to use the belt. I'm fairly certain.
Uh-huh. And then so she started having all these problems, and I mean, I can't believe the worlds that she was involved with. I mean, that's just so dangerous. And
Yes.
what about your father?
Well, my father, Edward Joseph Marcottes, of course, lived in New Orleans and lived there till the day he died. Their separation was not amiable at all. When I finally met my father, I was almost 40 years old, and he did not know much of anything about Mother's unusual life, and he certainly did not know that she had already died. But he immediately took me to his bedroom and pulled out legal papers to prove to me that the courts had ordered him to stay out of my life by demand of my mother. Of course, unfortunately, I didn't grow up knowing that. It would have been really nice to know that my father's absence was caused by the courts, not by all of his choosing. So, but he told me of something that happened. He did everything that he could to take care of Mother. I believe he loved her deeply, but he just could not handle her, especially when she was in the throes of drugs and alcohol. And in one incident, Mother was losing it in their house, and she broke a beer bottle over his head in the midst of their argument. And my dad said that was the day he decided that he just couldn't do this anymore. And so it wasn't long after that till Mother left New Orleans and processed divorce. And I literally did not talk to my dad or meet my dad till I was almost 40 years old.
Mm-hmm. So that's something positive that came up after you started to research and delve into your mom's history. And
Yes.
what drove you to do this in-depth research? Because you really, really discovered a vast amount of information.
I really have. And I never, when I did my PhD at Texas Tech, of course I did in-depth research and dissertation and all the associated activities. But the tools that I gained during my doctorate really facilitated everything that I've done. And I appreciate your acknowledging that I have uncovered a lot, and I have. And I haven't done all of it on my own. I've done some of it with the help of people like Gary Shaw, and some mysterious people who have sent me things in the mail unexpectedly. So I did become rather obsessed with researching as deeply as possible, especially after I realized that I was going to be probably turning my journal into a book and confronting the JFK assassination world, which I know them to be highly critical of lots of researchers other than themselves. I mean, it's just the way it is.
Yeah.
So,
absolutely.
and I have really weathered very well. I mean, my first edition of this book was published almost 5 years ago, and I have survived and have received, I think, very limited criticism. I think it's mainly, Ella, because of all the in-depth research that I have actually done and the documents that I've included in my book, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And did Oliver Stone approach you, or how did you find out that your mother's character was going to be portrayed in his film?
Well, honestly, when the JFK film came out, I was really on the front end of all of my research, and it did not really impact me at the time. I believe, wasn't it in the 90s, Don and Ella?
91. Yeah, 91.
91. Yeah, I was, really busy with pursuing things in my life, and it wasn't till much later that I actually confronted the fact that my mother's character was on that screen, and that she knew about the Kennedy assassination plans in advance, trying to warn authorities, and was ignored. I mean, that was quite a revelation that still honestly makes me shake my head a little bit even today.
Sure. And you talked a little about the research community, and I know that all too well, but they have, and I would think that you can, and Ella, I'm sure would be interested in hearing the story about what I think is the most important thing you and with Gary Shaw's help discovered, and that was that your mom probably was shot to death. You know, we'd always heard that it was a hit and run accident that ended up killing her. I think 1965, a few years after the assassination. But you guys, why don't you talk a little bit about that, and how did because that should have been a revelation that interested the critical community, but my guess is it didn't, because that's usually the way they work.
Yes, well, it was extremely interesting to me because I guarantee you my family had no clue about the exact details related to my mother's demise in 1965. And honestly, I don't believe that I would have definitively come to grips with it and realized it had I not been able to get my hands on the extremely lengthy medical records for my mother from Gladewater Municipal Hospital. And once it was a very interesting day when I went to retrieve those documents. I had Gary Shaw with me and my personal lawyer with me, and my showing up at the hospital created quite a stir. I know that sounds hard to believe, but it's true. When I announced to the people in medical records who I was and that I was there to retrieve my mother's medical records, things got very intense in the medical records room. And it took almost 5 hours for us to get them to release those documents to me, which I certainly had the right to have in my possession. But, you know, in the medical room, there were file cabinets all over that space. And of course, people's records were in those file cabinets. But when this attendant finally decided to put her hands on mother's records and let me have a copy of them, she went to the side of the room, pulled a large desk from the wall, and retrieved mother's records from behind the desk.
Wow, well, that's interesting. Yeah.
I just found that very strange. But in these documents, there is over 8 hours of minute medical care given to my mother, including the analysis or investigation of all of her wounds, including a punctate stellate wound in the forehead, which is commonly the terminology used by medical professionals to refer to gunshot wounds, close-range gunshot wound to the forehead. And I have, you know, I didn't just take that at first glance either. I have had almost a dozen individual physicians read the narrative in those medical records, especially regarding the punctate stellate wound, and every one of them has said, well, Michael, it really looks like your mother was shot in the head long before Jerry Don Moore came along that highway in his car.
And then the other interesting thing is that she was pronounced dead. Is this true? Before she even arrived at the hospital?
Yes, all of the death certificates have DOA stamped all over them. And obviously, most of us know that is dead on arrival. And my point about that is you're either dead on arrival or you aren't. You know, I find it hard to believe that they would have given 8.5 hours of intense medical care to a person who was already dead, including putting, they also set her broken forearm. They put a cast on her forearm. So, excuse me, there's just all kinds of incongruencies associated with that death certificate for sure. And then the medical records just prove it beyond the shadow of a doubt in my mind.
And how did you find out? How did you find out that she had died? And I know that must be painful to talk about, but I know you've probably talked about that in your book.
You know, Ella, it is it is painful to talk about, but not so painful that I can't do it, because the only way that I could get closer to my mother was to face every aspect of this horrible story. And so I just kept taking one step after the other. I just know that my family, when my mother died, was it hard on all of us? Absolutely. Was it hard on me? I would say it was peculiar, because I had only seen my mother 3 times that I recall, although I was completely in her care, her full-time care, until I was almost 5 years old. Although I was farmed out to my dad and his mother for short periods of time, my aunts and uncles, etc. But I was with mother for a time. I just don't remember those years. I remember being with her when I was about 5 years old on an Easter Sunday.
Hold that thought, Michael, because we're coming up on a break here, so we'll be right back.
Okay.
Welcome back to the show. We're talking with Michael Markades. Michael, before you were rudely interrupted by the commercials, why don't you go ahead and continue where you left off?
Thank you, Don. We were just talking a little bit about the 3 times that I remember being with mother, in spite of being with her for the 4 or 5 years, first 4 or 5 years of my life. I remember being with her on an Easter Sunday. In fact, I have pictures of us having pictures taken on that day in the front yard beneath the tree. I think I've included that picture in my book. I remember that day vividly. I also remember the day she showed up in a yellow cab outside of our small frame house near Duncanville, Texas. And then, of course, I remember her funeral. But that's about it. But I have been a little frustrated over the years with my family. But I have also kind of come to understand that they were just emotionally exhausted by the time 1965 came and mother died. But honestly, Don knows, and Ella, I'm sure you know, that her autopsy records were destroyed. None of those reports were shared with our family. Our family literally did not know exactly what happened to their daughter, to their sister. They were lied to, in my mind, that Jerry Don Moore hit her with his car and killed her. In reality, Jerry Don Moore turned into an angel who stopped in the middle of the night thinking that he had hit mother, and he stopped and picked her up and actually took her to a doctor in the country, and then to Gladewater Hospital. So, it's just kind of frustrating to me that when the iron was a little hotter, that my family did not follow up on the very peculiar evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. So what now, I think you would have been probably, if you had gotten into research a little bit earlier, I'm sure you probably heard of Penn Jones, who Gary Shaw worked a lot with. If Penn Jones had been alive when you first started researching it, he would have been very interested, obviously, because he wrote about Rose Cherami's death, he's the one who really started tabulating all the mysterious deaths. And he would have been very interested, hey, suddenly there's apparently a bullet hole in her, even if the rest of the critical community isn't. So I'm sorry you didn't get to, because he would have given you a completely different view. He probably would have been very interested in your story.
Right. Well, that would have been awesome. I have had the help of Gary Shaw and others, but, Penn Jones would have been nice to have had his input and guidance. But it didn't happen, so case raw.
Right. So, well, what do you, so at this point, like, you've written the book, people like me are impressed with it. You have a certain amount of people that are impressed with it. The critical community
Thank
is
you,
not,
Don.
well, it's not surprisingly kind of ignoring you, but they ignore me and they ignore most people. They're in their own little world. But
Yes.
unfortunately, that's why we don't get anything resolved, because they don't come together. But what's next for Michael Markakis? Like at this point, okay, because you've done, do you feel there's still work there's still something else you can do? Can you find definitive answers about more about your mother's death, or can you find out more about her life? What more would you do there? Or are you satisfied with this? You've done something great. I'm sure she'd be very proud of you, and you're going to move on to something else.
Well, I don't think I'll ever really feel finished with Mother's story until I know the name of the individual who killed her on that night. I'm convinced somebody out there is still alive who knows. I mean, weird things happen to me. You know, I received strange emails asking me if I could know the truth about my mother. What would I do with the information? Also, you know, a lady wrote me on Facebook claiming to have been a dear friend of my mother when she worked for Jack Ruby. And her comments on Facebook were, I loved her. She was my idol, and then they murdered her. You know, so there's still people out there who know some details. And honestly, in the past year, I have discovered that where we lived outside of Duncanville, where, you know, I referred to my mother driving up in the yellow cab, that house was actually secured for our family as a means of protecting me from those who would have gotten at me to keep Mother doing what she was doing. Because, I mean, I've had people contact me, trusted friends in the past year, who said, look, my dad secured that house for you guys because your grandfather and he were a part of an unusual group of men in Dallas, and they secured that house for you guys as a way for you guys to be safe. You know, so things keep coming up. You know, so I honestly don't know that I'll be ever finished with the story, but I am very, very, if it's okay to say, proud of what I have managed to do, particularly with the release of the second edition. I mean, it has been a hell of a lot of work. Over 30 years of my life I've devoted to research, and over 10 years of writing. So, you know, I'm proud of it. But I really didn't do it to get, you know, approval from the Kennedy assassination community.
No.
You know, I did it to know the truth about my mother. And I do believe that I have made a small contribution to the JFK community through this research.
You have. There's no question about it. And I wonder now, I know I can't get a hold of him, but I am friends with his son, Sean Stone. But I'm just wondering if Oliver Stone is aware of the book. And because I asked Sally, you know, Kirkland, when we all did a show some months back where Sally Kirkland and Michael were on. I think Gary Shaw was on it too. And it was exciting, you know, for both Michael and Sally, I think, because she played.
Yeah, it was. I'll never forget it. You know, at first I never imagined that I'd be in touch with Sally Kirkland, but I feel like she and I are unusually joined together forever. Mm-hmm. You know, because she had an interest in Mother's part in the story, and as I understand it, she went to Oliver Stone and said, look, you know, something along the lines of, I want to be involved in this landmark film. And Stone basically says, well, what do you want to do? She said, I want to be Rose Cherami. Mm-hmm. You know, so I honestly believe that she was responsible for the last-minute decision to include the character. So yeah. I don't know if Stone knows about my book or not. I do know that Netflix is looking at my book, which is pretty exciting.
Yeah, tell us more about that. Yeah, that is exciting.
Well, you know, things aren't moving very quickly in LA these days thanks to COVID.
Yeah.
But I had a gentleman in Texas who has produced over 25 films. And as I understand it, another lawyer friend of mine got in touch with me and said he'd like to read your book. So I gave him my book, and on the backside of his read, he said, "This will make a hell of a film." And ironically, Netflix had already contacted him, interested in his entire filmography. And he said, "Look, I'm taking this book with me. I believe it's something that Netflix needs to look at." And so we're just waiting for those meetings to actually transpire, and of course I have my fingers crossed. I believe it would make an amazing multiple episode series on Netflix. I just had so many people, I don't mean to sound arrogant at all, but many people who have read this book have been deeply touched by this story, and I think it would be awesome for the world at large to have access to it.
Mm-hmm. I agree 100%. It's a story made for film, and it also, it shows a lot. It indicates a lot about just
Yes.
continued cover-ups around JFK and whatever connection she had. And
Right.
it's a story that just won't go away. People just feel and sense that, and have heard that there was so much more to the story, to the
Of
JFK
course.
assassinations. And how did you feel when you heard JFK was assassinated?
Well, I was a fifth grader. I remember the day like probably millions of people. I remember the exact day. I had left my fifth grade classroom, gone to the restroom, and when I had come back, there had been an announcement over the old PA system that Kennedy had been shot. And, I can't really say that I understood the full impact, but I knew something horrible had happened. And of course, I could never in a million years have imagined that I would have had a connection to it through my mother. It's just hard to believe.
And I understand that you've been a professor and a middle school teacher. How did you choose that, or how did you get involved with teaching? Why was that such a passion for you?
Well, actually, most of my career I have been a college professor. I became a professional musician mainly because of a girl that I really was enamored with that lived down the street at that little frame house in Duncanville, and she played the trumpet. And I thought Claudia hung the moon. And so when it was time for me to pick an instrument, I picked the trumpet, and the rest is history. 50 years later, I've been a professional trumpet player, classically trained. I've been a college professor in choral music, and I have a master's degree in sacred literature from the seminary. So, it's just really interesting to me how all that came to be. But I, in these days, I'm almost, next month I'll turn 68. And so recently in the past few years, I ran into some heart issues that pretty much shut down my ability to work constantly in education. It's a very demanding field. And so I do keep my hands in education by serving as an embedded substitute at an IB World School here in the Georgetown area and various places. It's hard to stop teaching completely, but I really miss teaching college. I had a wonderful career at Texas Tech and Columbus State University and a university in Alabama, but those days are over, and some things don't last forever. So.
Right. So what plans do you have in the future? I mean, I understand that your mother's story, your book, has the potential, the possibility of becoming a show, and I'm sure you'll be involved heavily with that. What other goals do you have? What does your future look like?
That's a really interesting question, Ella, to put me on the spot. Right now, my main goal is to love my wife as well as I possibly can, and to stay in touch with my kids. Their lives are going 90 to nothing. So I'm trying to do everything that Kelly and I can to stay in touch with our children. But honestly, we're trying to love each other well, trying to honor God with our lives as much as we can, and trying to survive the very strange world that we now live in.
Mm-hmm. What do you think? What's your political stance? I know that might be a topic you might not want to go into, but I'm just curious. We're talking about presidents in a way. We talked about JFK, so I'm just curious what your political opinions are, and if you even have interest in politics.
Oh, I am deeply interested in politics. I don't, I'm not real pleased. I can't say that I'm pleased with Democrats. I can't say that I'm pleased with Republicans. I'm just not that pleased with government. I just think that the level of corruption has gone beyond anything that we could possibly describe. And honestly, I do not know the answer to what the state that we are in presently. Really, I'm not saying it's about Democrats. I'm not saying it's about Republicans. I'm saying it's about humanity. And for me personally, I believe that America needs to find its way back to God, and that would be step one. But I would never assume to have all the answers. I just know that America is in a tough spot.
Yeah, it's a mess right now. It really is.
It is a mess. And my wife and I literally try to be hopeful that good things will happen. And if good things don't happen, then we try to make sure that we are in good, strong connection with Jesus. That's just the way we choose to live our lives.
And with your children, do they also have an interest in your mother's story? What's their reaction and their response, and what are their feelings about your mother?
Well, honestly, I have been very surprised at their lack of interest. All of our kids are under 45. Some of them in their 20s, some in their 30s, some in their early 40s. And actually, I was speaking at a conference in Dallas several years ago, and a psychology professor raised his hand and asked me that very question. And I just admitted to the entire group and to him that my kids actually don't seem very interested. I don't know if they're embarrassed by this or if they have fear attached to it or what. I mean, I honestly doubt that any of my children have read the book from cover to cover.
Well, Michael, you're not alone. Just to interrupt you, that's very common. Because you're not exactly a whistleblower in the classic sense, but you are kind of blowing the whistle on something. You're a whistleblower in a sense, although it's personal to you. But so many people, and Ella, I'm sure knows this as well, but so many people that I've talked to over the years, it's that you get that story all the time that the families, I think probably it's mostly out of fear. And we saw that with Jim Garrison. If you watch JFK, that was very accurate the way he portrayed, and he says to Sissy Spacek, damn, I can't fight you in the whole world too, Liv, and right. and that's what happened. And the saddest part of that, a postscript that even though Garrison, I don't know if you heard this story or not, and I just learned it from John Barber a while back, but when Garrison was on his deathbed, now his wife, she left him. She didn't,
Yes.
I mean, he did she didn't stand by him when the whole world was against him. He called her to his bedside and had them get remarried again on his deathbed so she would qualify for his pension. I mean, I can't think of anything. You talk about selfless. I mean, to me, that really made me appreciate the man that much more. But sad postscript, even though he did something like that, he had, I think, 5 or 6 kids. All of them except one have basically turned their backs on his legacy and have no interest in it. The only one that does, unfortunately, has had some issues, so he's not the best spokesman for him. But I don't know. Sorry to be a bummer, but just that is very common. And those, I can testify. I have a huge family, and almost no one's interested in my work. It just isn't. I mean, I have 6 books and they don't read my book. I mean, that's just, I don't know why that is. And I've talked to other people. It's that way, and it does kind of surprise you and hurt you, but I don't know. It's part of human nature, I guess.
Yeah, human
Well,
nature doesn't want to focus on something that might be perceived as negative or scary, because it's kind of scary to know. It's scary to delve into the truths, because sometimes the truths are dark, and people don't. They want to focus on what's good and happy, and they just don't want to go into, because sometimes the truth is dark. They just don't want to go there. There's just something in the human mind that wants to protect itself from information like that. But unfortunately, things aren't going to change until people pay attention and are willing to listen and to educate and to understand some of the deeper truths.
right. Well, for me, once I started the road, there was no stopping. I mean, I had to learn everything that I possibly could. And I've had people say, "Man, haven't you been scared?" And my response is, maybe I'm stupid, but my answer to that is no. If something happens to me, it just proves that I was on the right track.
Mm-hmm.
But Don, it does hurt a little bit when your family doesn't pay attention to what you busted yourself to accomplish. But
I can commiserate. I can relate. Believe me, yes.
My gosh, this was my kid's grandmother. I just don't understand why they don't want to know.
That's a little surprising. I'm not writing about people. So yeah, because they're connected too. Yeah, you think at least one of them would have an interest.
Granted, Mother's life was indeed sordid. I understand, but in the end, even that female, that human, knew right from wrong and did everything she could to try to do the right thing. I just call that the silver lining of Mother's life. And if I get to see her someday, I don't have everything sorted out in my mind about heaven and all of that. But if I get to be in connection with her in the eternal in some way, man, I will run straight to her. And
that's great.
Ask her questions for 10 years if I can.
Well, she tried to in her way to warn what was going to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what else she could have done. And her whatever she was guilty of were, we used to, when I was a kid, there used to be a popular expression, victimless crimes. No one talks about that anymore, but your mother, whatever she was involved in, they were all victimless crimes. And, so what we used to call that. So I don't think she intentionally harmed anyone. So I wouldn't judge her harshly.
No, she didn't harm anybody but herself.
Right.
And her story, gosh, her hospitalizations, the research that I've uncovered about her hospitalizations is just staggering. Or little things like when my uncle at Gladewater Hospital, someone at the hospital reported to him that a, quote, red-haired cousin had already showed up to identify her body. Now tell me what that is. Somebody came by that hospital to make sure she was dead.
Yeah,
That's
it sounds
crazy.
like there's so many movies that have scenes like that. People want people dead. They want them silenced because they know too much. But part of it, her credibility might have been shot, of course. I mean, it was probably hard to take her warning seriously, unfortunately,
Right.
because people judge people on background.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that is a very sad reality, Ella.
Yes.
I've thought many times, and I've written a couple of small articles about whether she would have been a credible or incredible witness, with kind of a play on the words. Personally, I think she would have been an incredible witness. No telling what all she knew, what all she had seen, and in the end, she just had to be eliminated for a variety of reasons, which is super sad.
Yes.
I just every now and then I get lost in thinking about her last 30 minutes of life about the hell that she must have gone through out in the middle of nowhere, near Gladewater, Texas. But thank God for Jerry Don Moore. I like to always put in a good word for Jerry Don Moore because, my family blamed him for killing my mother. Mm-hmm. And they took away his driver's license, which means he was a truck driver. He was not able to drive for over 2 years. I mean, they did everything they could to punish him, and he should have been heralded and thanked.
And he, of course, had no knowledge of a gunshot. He thought he had done it, so he didn't argue. Right?
Yes.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. He thought he had run over her head, but the State Highway Patrol couldn't find hair. They couldn't find skin. They didn't find tread marks. I mean, he didn't hit her. In spite of the unusual scene that was set up on that highway with Mother's suitcases angled in the road designed to take an oncoming car toward her body. I mean, it's a miracle he just didn't keep driving.
Michael, we're running low on time. I want to give you a chance to give any links out you want, or tell the people whatever you want to promote here.
Absolutely. If anyone's interested in getting a copy of the book, they can go to rosecherami.com, RoseCherami.com, or they can write me at michaelmarcades@gmail.com. And I'd be glad to process autographed copies or whatever. But, of course, it's available on Amazon. It's available through Free American Press, American Free Press, which you know very well, Don.
As I do.
A great paper. So there's a variety of ways, and I hope to hear from some of your audience.
And I just want you to know, I admire and respect you so much.
Sure.
For number one, how you were able to turn your life around, or keep your life on track, I should say, and the courage you have and have had in pursuing the story.
I appreciate that, Ella. Thank you
Absolutely.
very much.
Yeah. Well, you guys can catch videos and some of our other interviews on A Good Place with Ella. I'm going to create our own channel, and on there are Donald and I, our previous interviews. And, we have the opportunity to interview amazing, interesting, and often be able to listen to poignant stories. And I think they're all worth listening to. And of course, like we mentioned, we have interviewed a lot of celebrities, and even Sally Kirkland, who we referred to today.
Right.
And we'll catch everybody next week. And thank you for this opportunity once more. Donald, it's a pleasure.